Dr. Evan Cole, a renowned black heart surgeon, faces a harrowing ordeal when a corrupt and racist sheriff targets him during a visit to a small town. What begins as a routine stop quickly turns hostile, with Evan subjected to wrongful accusations, public humiliation, and blatant abuse of power. Despite his status and reputation, the sheriff's prejudice blinds him to Evan's dignity and achievements, exposing the deep-rooted racism in the community. As tensions escalate, Evan's calm resilience clashes with the sheriff's arrogance, leading to a confrontation that forces hidden truths to the surface and pushes the system to its breaking point. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the large windows of Millie's diner, casting a warm glow across its checkered tile floors and red leather booths. It was a place frozen in time. Walls decorated with faded pictures of town parades, hand-painted signs for daily specials, and a jukebox in the corner that rarely worked but stood proudly anyway. The air smelled of fresh coffee and buttered pancakes, the sort of comfort that had made Millie's a local favorite for generations. Dr. Nathan Cole didn't look like he belonged there. At least, not in the way others might assume. He sat at the far corner booth, his laptop open and a steaming cup of black coffee sitting untouched at his side. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up just below his elbows, and a sleek watch peeked from beneath his cuff. His dark suit jacket rested neatly on the seat beside him, evidence that he hadn't just wandered in for a casual breakfast. Nathan glanced up briefly as a waitress passed his table, offering a polite smile before returning his focus to his screen. From the calm, steady way he moved, and the quiet confidence in his posture, there was no mistaking that Nathan was used to being in control, but there were no frills to him, no designer flair, no flashy car parked outside. If not for the practiced precision with which he carried himself, he might have passed for just another local stopping by for coffee before work. What Millie's patrons didn't know was that Dr. Nathan Cole was one of the most sought-after cardiac surgeons in the country. A man who had saved more lives in his 41 years than most could count, his hands steadying hearts that others had written off as beyond repair. And yet, here he was, hunched over an open laptop and a diner menu in Millbrook, a town so small that it didn't even have a traffic light at its busiest intersection. He didn't look up as the bell above the door chimed, but the energy in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. A few patrons turned toward the entrance, muttering low comments to one another. "Morning, Sheriff," someone called from the counter. Nathan glanced up and met eyes with Sheriff Frank Daniels, tall, broad-shouldered, and always in uniform, even on weekends. Daniels carried himself like a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. He exchanged pleasantries with a few townsfolk before his gaze landed on Nathan. A faint crease appeared between the sheriff's brows, as though Nathan's presence were an unsolved puzzle. Daniels approached Nathan's table slowly, his heavy boots making deliberate thuds against the floor. "You new around here?" Daniels asked, his tone deceptively casual. Nathan glanced up, his expression neutral but polite. "Just passing through." Daniels tilted his head, eyeing the laptop and the neatly folded suit jacket. "Passing through and working, odd choice of scenery for a city man like yourself." Nathan resisted the urge to sigh. He'd encountered this tone before, questions that weren't really questions at all, just veiled suspicions meant to test his patience. "I enjoy the quiet," Nathan replied, his voice calm and even. Daniels let out a faint chuckle. "Well, Millie's is as quiet as it gets, long as you don't mind us locals." Nathan's polite smile didn't falter. "Not at all." The sheriff lingered for a beat longer than necessary, his gaze flicking across Nathan's face, his watch, his laptop. Finally, Daniels gave a curt nod and stepped away, joining a table of deputies on the other side of the diner. Nathan took a sip of his coffee, his eyes dropping back to his screen. He was here for a reason, a long overdue property matter in Millbrook that had been tied up in legal knots for months. The details weren't important yet. What mattered was that Nathan had intended to handle his business quietly and leave just as quietly. But Millie's was the kind of place where strangers didn't stay. Strangers for long. A low, amused voice broke his concentration. "They don't get a lot of new faces around here." Nathan looked up to find a woman standing beside his table. Her name tag read, Gina, and she was holding a coffee pot in one hand, the other resting casually on her hip. She was maybe mid-30s, with tired but kind eyes and an easy smile. "Seems that way," Nathan said, matching her faint smile. "You want a top off?" she asked, gesturing to his cup. Sure, Nathan replied, sliding it toward her. Gina filled the cup, pausing only briefly before speaking again. Don't mind Sheriff Daniels. He's like that with anyone who doesn't look like they rolled out of bed 2 blocks away. Nathan gave a soft chuckle. I'll keep that in mind. She hesitated, her voice dropping slightly. What brings you here, if you don't mind me asking? Nathan considered his answer carefully. Business. She arched an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced but too polite to push further. Well, if you need anything, just holler. Thank you, Gina. She gave him a small nod and moved on to the next table, but Nathan could feel the eyes on him, the furtive glances from behind newspapers and coffee cups, as though the entire diner had collectively decided he was someone worth watching. It wasn't new. Nathan was no stranger to the weight of assumptions. A black man in a suit sitting alone in a small-town diner always drew curiosity, sometimes suspicion, sometimes worse. Years of hard-earned success hadn't shielded him from the gaze of those who refused to see past their own expectations. The bell above the door chimed again, and 2 men walked in, both wearing worn-out flannel jackets and mud-streaked boots. They were loud as they entered, their laughter grating against the otherwise quiet hum of the diner. Nathan barely noticed them at first, his attention back on his laptop. Can't believe you still had to work on that Sunday shift, one of the men said, his voice carrying across the room. Yeah, well, that's what happens when these suits keep thinking they can come around and push folks out, the other replied, loud enough for Nathan to catch the comment. The first man muttered something in agreement, and though Nathan kept his eyes on his screen, he felt the subtle shift in the air. A few minutes later, their voices grew closer. Hey buddy, you the one driving that fancy black car outside? Nathan looked up slowly. Both men were now standing beside his booth, one of them leaning just a little too far over the table. Nathan glanced at them briefly, his calm demeanor unshaken. Is there a problem? He asked evenly. The man closest to him sneered. No problem, just figured someone dressed like you would have somewhere better to be than Millie's. Nathan kept his expression neutral, his voice measured. I like the coffee here. The second man laughed harshly. You hear that, Joe? He likes the coffee. Guess we're lucky to be blessed with his company. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably, and Nathan caught sight of Gina watching the scene carefully from behind the counter. Nathan closed his laptop with deliberate calm, his gaze steady, as he looked up at the men. If you have something to say, gentlemen, I'd suggest saying it, and letting me finish my coffee. Joe stepped back slightly, clearly thrown off by Nathan's composure, but his companion wasn't as easily deterred. Don't get smart with us. We don't need people like you thinking they can walk in here and look down on us. Nathan's jaw tightened, but he stayed seated, his voice dropping slightly. I'm not looking down on anyone, I'm just here to have breakfast, that's all. Joe grabbed his friend's arm, muttering something under his breath, but the man shrugged him off. The confrontation lingered on the edge of escalation, and for the first time, Nathan felt the diner go completely silent. Sheriff Daniels, still seated across the room, watched the exchange carefully, but made no move to intervene. Nathan held the man's gaze. Why don't you finish your breakfast and let me finish mine? Joe finally pulled his friend back. Come on, man, it's not worth it. The 2 men muttered something as they walked off, their boots thudding heavily against the floor. Nathan exhaled quietly, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction as he reopened his laptop. The eyes in the diner didn't leave him, and he could still feel Daniels watching from across the room. The stage was set. Nathan Cole had been underestimated before, but something about Millbrook felt different. There was something in the air, a storm brewing just beyond the horizon, and Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done being tested here. Nathan remained at his corner booth, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. His calm facade had not cracked, but inside, a low hum of frustration buzzed beneath his ribs. He had been here before. Different places, different faces, same script. The pointed glances, the casual remarks dripping with condescension, and the underlying message that he didn't belong. It was exhausting. Across the diner, Sheriff Daniels kept his eyes on Nathan, pretending to sip his coffee. The 2 men from earlier had settled into a table near the window, but they hadn't stopped talking about him. Nathan could feel it. Words like, city type, and doesn't belong here, floated through the air. though they were careful to keep their voices low now that the room had grown quieter. Nathan let out a slow breath and focused on the document in front of him. He had come here to settle a property matter, an old house on the edge of town that had belonged to his aunt. She'd passed nearly a year ago, leaving behind a small piece of land tangled up in legal confusion. It was supposed to be simple, a quick visit to sign paperwork and ensure the property was in good hands. Instead, it felt like walking on glass. "Here you go, sir." Nathan looked up as Gina slid a fresh plate of toast and scrambled eggs onto the table. Her voice was warm, but there was an unease in her smile, a silent apology for the tension lingering in the air. "Thank you, Gina," Nathan said softly. "Let me know if you need anything else," she replied, but before turning away she added, "You'll get used to us eventually." Nathan's eyebrows twitched faintly. Get used to us, as though he were the foreign element here, disrupting their well-oiled routine just by existing. He offered her a small nod and forced himself to take a bite of his toast, chewing while the tension in his stomach twisted. Just as Nathan returned to his laptop, the bell above the diner's door jingled. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their badges catching the light. Nathan watched them approach the counter, exchanging nods with Daniels, before taking stools just a few feet from his table. He recognized the way their eyes darted toward him, lingering for just a beat too long before looking away. Don't let it bother you. He'd told himself this 1,000 times. Keep calm. Stay focused. Don't give anyone a reason to doubt you, judge you, fear you. But prejudice didn't need a reason. You're still here, huh? The voice belonged to Sheriff Daniels, who had abandoned his deputies and wandered back toward Nathan's booth. Nathan set his fork down, meeting the sheriff's gaze. Daniels gestured toward the empty seat across from him. Mind if I sit? Nathan motioned faintly with his hand. Go ahead. The sheriff slid into the booth, settling in with a slow, deliberate motion, like he was sizing Nathan up. Nathan stayed quiet, waiting for Daniels to speak. You from the city? Daniels finally asked, breaking the silence. I live in Atlanta, Nathan replied. Born and raised. Daniels nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Big place. A man must do pretty well for himself to wear a suit like that on a weekday. Nathan met the remark head on, keeping his tone neutral. I'm a surgeon. I've worked hard to get where I am. A doctor? Daniels repeated, his brows lifting slightly in mock surprise. Well, that's impressive, Bet. A place like Atlanta keeps you busy. It does. Daniels leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. So, what brings you to Millbrook doesn't seem like the kind of town that would need someone of your expertise. Nathan suppressed the flicker of irritation behind his calm exterior. I'm here to finalize some family business, nothing more. Daniels tilted his head, his smile sharpening into something less friendly. Family business? That's funny. Most folks here take care of their own without needing lawyers and out-of-towners. Nathan's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. I'm sure they do. But this isn't up for discussion, Sheriff. I'm here for the day, and I'll be out of your way soon enough. Daniels sat back, his expression unreadable, though the thin line of his mouth betrayed his disapproval. We like to keep an eye on things around here, Dr. Cole. You never know who might come into town looking for trouble. Nathan's jaw tightened, but he held his composure. Good to know you're vigilant, Sheriff. Daniels didn't move immediately. He stared at Nathan for a long moment, as though searching for a crack in his calm exterior. Finally, he pushed himself up from the booth, leaving Nathan with a lingering parting shot. Enjoy your breakfast, Doctor. You'll find Millbrook's got a way of humbling outsiders. Nathan's fingers clenched briefly around his coffee cup, the slight tremble betraying the anger bubbling beneath the surface. A way of humbling outsiders. He had heard enough variations of that sentiment throughout his life to know exactly what it meant. Nathan closed his laptop, suddenly uninterested in whatever work remained undone. He left a crisp $20 bill on the table and slid his jacket back on. As he walked toward the exit, he felt every pair of eyes in the diner on him, watching, weighing, judging. Sheriff Daniels remained by the counter, his expression smug as Nathan passed him. Safe travels, Daniels called out, his tone dripping with false politeness. Nathan didn't respond. He pushed the door open, the bell ringing above his head, and stepped into the bright morning sunlight. Nathan had parked his black sedan just across the gravel lot. It was a sleek car, clean, polished, and, in a town like this, impossible to miss. He unlocked the doors with a soft chirp and slid behind the wheel, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel as he sat there for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. There was no need to let Daniels or anyone else here get under his skin. He'd dealt with men like that before, men who wore their authority like a weapon, wielding it indiscriminately against those they didn't understand or accept. Nathan exhaled and checked his watch. He still had time before his meeting at the courthouse, but suddenly, the idea of lingering anywhere in Millbrook longer than necessary left a bitter taste in his mouth. He started the car, the engine purring to life, and pulled out of the lot, gravel crunching beneath the tires. At the Millbrook County Courthouse, Nathan found himself seated in a cramped waiting room lined with uncomfortable plastic chairs and faded notices pinned to a bulletin board. A low hum of conversation buzzed from nearby offices, punctuated by the occasional sound of a closing door. Nathan checked his phone for updates while he waited, but the tension from earlier refused to fade. It clung to him like a film, a feeling that he was being watched. Finally, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Dr. Cole?" Nathan looked up to see a middle-aged clerk with glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She held a manila folder in her hands and offered a polite, if hesitant, smile. "Right this way," she said, motioning for him to follow. Nathan stood, smoothing his jacket as he walked behind her. She led him into a small office where a man in a poorly fitted blazer sat hunched over a desk. Judge Marcus Clay, according to the nameplate. The man didn't look up immediately, his pen scratching over a document as Nathan entered. "Dr. Cole," the judge said after a moment, finally lifting his gaze. His tone lacked warmth. "Have a seat." Nathan did as instructed, carefully observing the man across from him. Judge Clay's gaze flickered briefly to Nathan's suit, then to the papers in front of him. "Property matter, huh?" Clay said, flipping through the folder. "This house of your aunt's, it's been abandoned for years." "That's correct," Nathan replied evenly. "I'm here to resolve the ownership and ensure it's properly maintained." Clay snorted softly. "Interesting. Most folks just let these things go, especially when there's no real value to the land." Nathan resisted the urge to frown. "Value isn't always measured in dollars, Judge Clay." Clay's eyes narrowed slightly, as though the remark offended him. "I suppose not." He scribbled something onto the file before leaning back in his chair. "We'll process the paperwork, but I'll need you to come back in a week or so for a final decision." Nathan's brows furrowed faintly. "I was told this would be resolved today." "Well," Clay said, shrugging, "things move slower in Millbrook. We like to be thorough." Nathan met the judge's gaze evenly. Thorough, another word weaponized to delay and obstruct. "Of course," Nathan replied, his voice calm, though he could feel his patience thinning. "I'll expect a prompt update." The judge didn't respond, his attention already drifting back to his desk. Nathan stood, buttoning his jacket as he exited the office. The tension in the courthouse felt no different than it had in the diner. A silent, suffocating pressure that clung to him every step of the way. Nathan walked out into the afternoon sun, his heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. For all his calm and composure, he couldn't deny the truth gnawing at the edge of his mind. Millbrook wasn't just a town set in its ways, it was a town looking for reasons to push him out. Nathan stepped out of the courthouse, the sun now sharper, glaring down as though the town itself was watching him. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel, the sound unusually loud in the quiet parking lot. He paused to inhale deeply, centering himself. "Don't let them get under your skin." It was a mantra he'd repeated countless times over the years, yet the weight of this small town's unspoken hostility pressed against his chest like an invisible hand. From across the lot, a voice called out, "Well, if it isn't the good doctor." Nathan turned to see Sheriff Daniels leaning against his patrol car, arms folded, sunglasses reflecting the midday light. His smug expression hadn't changed since their encounter in the diner. Nathan's jaw tightened, but his face betrayed nothing. "Sheriff," Nathan replied evenly, keeping his tone polite but clipped. Daniels pushed himself off the car, striding over with deliberate slowness, the kind of gait designed to assert dominance. "Heard things didn't go quite your way in there," he said, jerking his head toward the courthouse. "Shame must be frustrating for someone like you, used to snapping your fingers and having doors fly open." Nathan forced a small smile. "I'd hope a man in your position would know better than to spread gossip. Things are moving along just fine." Daniel stopped a few feet from him, close enough to force Nathan to stand his ground. He slid off his sunglasses and tucked them into his shirt pocket, revealing eyes that held none of the lazy charm his voice carried. "Just trying to look out for my town, Dr. Cole," he said, his voice dropping. "We're simple folks here. People don't take too kindly to outsiders stirring things up." Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "Stirring things up? I came here to settle a legal matter. Nothing more." Daniels tilted his head, his lip curling into a half-smile. "Maybe, maybe not. Word is, folks have seen you poking around the outskirts, asking about land, old property. Makes people nervous. Makes me nervous." Nathan's fingers curled slightly, but he remained calm. "I don't answer to rumors, Sheriff. Or to you. For that matter, I trust you have more pressing matters than keeping tabs on me." Daniel's smile faded, his jaw tightening just a fraction. "Careful. Doc, pride's a dangerous thing to carry into a place like this. Sometimes it'll knock you down when you least expect it." Nathan stared at him, his patience thinning to a frayed edge. "That almost sounds like a threat." Daniel shrugged, slipping his sunglasses back on. "Just some friendly advice, safe travels." With that, the sheriff turned and walked back to his car, leaving Nathan standing alone in the parking lot, his words hanging like smoke in the still air. Nathan drove toward his aunt's property, gripping the steering wheel tighter than he intended. Daniel's words echoed in his mind, each one dripping with the kind of pointed threat that men like him never bothered to mask. Nathan had heard it before, seen it before. But this felt different. Daniels wasn't just flexing his power. He was daring Nathan to challenge him. As Nathan turned down a winding dirt road leading to the house, his thoughts churned. The old property had been in his family for decades, passed down like an heirloom. Yet somewhere in the murky tangle of local records and disputed ownership, it had become an easy target, something they wanted to take. When the house came into view, Nathan slowed the car. It was small and weathered, tucked away behind overgrown trees. The front porch sagged, and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving gray boards exposed like old bones. Nathan stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot breaking the stillness. He stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle over him. Despite its neglect, the house held a kind of history, a quiet dignity that reminded him of his aunt, proud and resilient until the very end. Nathan pulled out his phone, snapping a few pictures of the property. He needed evidence, something tangible to help unravel the legal mess. As he moved toward the side of the house, something caught his eye. Tire tracks. Fresh ones, carved into the soft earth leading around the back. He frowned, his senses sharpening. Someone had been here recently. He followed the tracks, stepping carefully through the brush, until he saw it. A broken window near the back door. Nathan's pulse quickened. He approached cautiously, peering through the glass. The inside was dark, but a faint glimmer of movement caught his attention. "Someone's in there." "Hey!" Nathan called, his voice firm. "Whoever's in there, you need to come out. This is private property." The faint movement stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, there was a loud crash, glass shattering from the far side of the house. Nathan's instincts kicked in, and he sprinted around the corner just in time to see a figure bolting into the woods. A man wearing a dark hoodie, carrying something under his arm. Nathan's first instinct was to give chase, but he stopped himself. He wasn't here to play hero. Instead, he took a quick photo of the fleeing figure before turning back to the house. Inside, he found chaos. Drawers had been pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. The few belongings his aunt had left behind had been rifled through, some tossed aside like trash. Nathan's jaw clenched as he stepped through the mess, spotting an old family album lying face down. He picked it up gently, brushing off the dust. They weren't here for valuables, he realized. They were looking for something specific. Before he could think further, the faint sound of an engine rumbled in the distance. Nathan turned sharply, stepping back outside. A patrol car was pulling up the drive, its lights flashing. Not an emergency signal, but a warning. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, his face etched with forced concern. Well, well, Daniels drawled, surveying the scene. What do we have here? Nathan turned to face him. Someone broke into this house. I caught a man running off into the woods. I have photos. Whoa there, Doc, Daniels interrupted, holding up a hand. Let's not jump to conclusions. How do I know you didn't do this yourself? Nathan froze, stunned into silence for a moment. Excuse me? Daniels shrugged, stepping closer. Far as I know, this property's been abandoned for years. Maybe you came here looking for something and got a little carried away. Nathan stared at him, anger bubbling to the surface. Are you seriously accusing me of vandalizing my own family's property? Daniels met his gaze with an infuriating calm. I'm just saying it's suspicious a stranger shows up, and suddenly there's a break-in. Doesn't look good. Nathan pulled out his phone, holding it up. I have pictures of the man who did this. You can see for yourself. Daniels smirked, but didn't take the phone. Sure, I'll take a statement. But first, I think you should come down to the station with me, clear this up. Nathan's heart pounded. You're not serious. Dead serious, Doc, unless you'd prefer I call for backup and let them sort it out. Nathan knew what this was, a power play. Daniels wasn't interested in justice. He wanted control. He wanted Nathan to bow, to submit, to feel small. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then, Nathan slipped his phone back into his pocket. Fine, let's go. Daniel's smirk widened. Good choice. In the back of the patrol car, Nathan stared out the window, his mind racing. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what Daniels was trying to do. Paint him as the villain, muddy the waters until the truth became irrelevant. But Nathan had spent his life fighting against systems designed to break men like him. Daniels didn't know who he was dealing with. As the car pulled into the station, Nathan sat straighter, his resolve hardening. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fluorescent lights of the station buzzed faintly as Nathan sat rigidly in the cold metal chair of the interrogation room. The walls were bare, save for a cracked clock ticking just loudly enough to grate on his nerves. A single table sat between him and the empty seat on the other side, mocking in its stillness. He'd been here for nearly an hour now, waiting. Sheriff Daniels had deliberately left him to stew. Nathan knew the tactic well. Isolation and silence were meant to break you down, to make you feel powerless. But Nathan Cole wasn't a man who broke easily. The door creaked open, and Daniels entered, his polished boots clicking against the tile floor. He carried a thin folder under his arm, more for effect than necessity. Nathan could see the man's satisfaction barely hidden beneath his otherwise stoic expression. Daniels took his time sitting down, opening the folder, and arranging its contents in a painfully slow manner. Nathan watched him carefully. Every motion was deliberate, meant to establish dominance, but he wouldn't play into the sheriff's game. Instead, he folded his hands and waited, his expression calm and composed. Daniels finally looked up, his smirk returning like an unwanted guest. Doc, I've got to say, you're in a bit of a pickle here. Nathan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Daniels continued, leaning back in his chair. We've got property damage, an unauthorized presence on abandoned land, and now, word of you harassing locals. Nathan's jaw clenched, but he forced his voice to remain steady. I didn't damage anything. Someone broke into the house, and I caught them fleeing. I even have photos on my phone. Have you bothered looking at those yet? Daniels smirked wider, shaking his head slowly. See, that's the problem with you people. You think a little technology gives you all the answers. Nathan's calm cracked, his eyes narrowing slightly. You people? Daniels pretended to ignore the accusation. I asked around about you. Doc, word travels fast in small towns like this. Fancy degrees, big city life, but you come back here, sticking your nose in places it doesn't belong. He tapped his temple mockingly. What's the phrase? Old money stays old for a reason. Nathan's patience evaporated. He leaned forward, his voice a low growl. Let's cut through the nonsense, Daniels. You don't like that I've come here asking questions. Fine. But that house belongs to my family. What exactly are you trying to cover up? Daniel's smile dropped in an instant. He slammed his palm against the table with enough force to rattle Nathan's coffee cup. Watch your mouth. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Nathan stared into Daniel's eyes, unflinching. It was as though a silent war had erupted in the room, their wills clashing in the still air. Finally, Daniels sat back, forcing a chuckle. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you, Doc?" Nathan shook his head. "I don't need to be smarter, Daniels. I just need to be right. And I am." Daniels' face darkened. He tapped his fingers against the table rhythmically, as if considering his next move. Finally, he stood up. "Stay put," Daniels barked before striding out, the door slamming shut behind him. Nathan rubbed his temples as minutes turned into another agonizing hour. His phone, confiscated at intake, was now in Daniels' hands. A dangerous position. He knew Daniels would use whatever leverage he could to muddy the waters, twisting facts into an unrecognizable mess. Suddenly the door burst open, and Mitchell stepped in, his expression tight. The younger officer's face was pale as he closed the door behind him, his voice low. "Dr. Cole, listen, I don't have much time. This isn't right, but Daniels has it out for you. He's trying to pin the vandalism on you and make this go away." Nathan frowned, straightening. "Go away?" Mitchell hesitated, shifting his weight as though battling an internal war. "I overheard him on the phone. He's trying to keep this quiet because someone in town, someone powerful, doesn't want the property to resurface in public records." Nathan's stomach twisted. "This is bigger than I thought." "Mitchell," Nathan said firmly, "you know what Daniels is doing is wrong. He's setting me up to protect someone else. Are you really going to let that happen?" Mitchell's face flushed. "You don't understand. This isn't just about Daniels. It's the town council. Some of the old families, they don't want outsiders digging up the past." Nathan's gaze softened. "And what about you? You signed up to serve this community, not to protect men like Daniels." Mitchell opened his mouth, but hesitated, looking over his shoulder at the door. "I can't help you, not officially, but I'll try to stall. Daniels is preparing a report. Once it's filed, you'll be locked up until Monday." Nathan exhaled sharply. "That gives me 48 hours to prove this isn't me." Mitchell nodded, his hand already on the doorknob. "If you have anyone who can help, you better get word to them fast, and Doc, watch your back." The door clicked shut, leaving Nathan alone again. But now, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just about the property, it was about power. Daniels, the council, the town. They had operated unchecked for far too long, but he wouldn't let them win. The evening air hit Nathan like a wave as he finally stepped out of the station. Daniels had released him under the guise of a warning, but Nathan knew better. This was only temporary. As he approached his car, he spotted a familiar face waiting for him by the hood. It was Elena Matthews, a local journalist he'd met years ago during his aunt's funeral. Back then, she'd been young and green, but now she carried herself with a quiet, sharp confidence. "Dr. Cole," she called out, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "I heard what happened at the station. Care to comment?" Nathan shook his head with a tired smile. "Not yet, Elena, but something tells me you already know what's going on." She nodded. "I've been digging into old land records, just like you. Your family's property sits right on top of land someone very powerful wants to claim, quietly." "Daniels is covering for them," Nathan said. "Of course he is," Elena replied, her voice lowering. "But I can't publish without hard evidence. If we're going to bring this to light, we need proof documents, witness statements, something they can't deny." Nathan met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "Then let's get it." That night, Nathan sat at his aunt's old desk in the dusty house, papers strewn around him. Elena sat across from him, typing furiously on her laptop. "This," Elena said, holding up a faded deed, "is the original claim to the property. But look, half of it's been redacted in the official record. Someone scrubbed it clean." Nathan's mind raced. "Which means someone didn't want the public to see it. If we can find the unedited version." Elena nodded. "We prove that your family's claim is legitimate, and Daniel's house of cards falls apart." Suddenly, the sound of tires crunching on gravel cut through the silence. Nathan froze, glancing out the window. 2 cars pulled up. Police cars. Elena's face paled. "Daniels!" Nathan stood, his pulse quickening. "Get your laptop, go out the back, now!" "What about you?" Elena asked, panic rising in her voice. Nathan's gaze was calm, but firm. "I'll hold them off. You need to get this information out. They can't stop us both." She hesitated, but grabbed her bag. "Be careful." Nathan watched as she disappeared into the night before squaring his shoulders and stepping onto the porch, just as Daniels emerged from his patrol car, flanked by 2 other officers. Daniels' smirk returned, but his eyes were cold. "Evening, Doc," he said, resting his hand on his belt. "You're trespassing again, and this time I'm not letting you walk away." Nathan stood tall, unshaken. "Do what you have to, Daniels. But this ends tonight." Daniels' smirk faltered, just slightly, as Nathan stepped forward, his words ringing like a battle cry. "I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not leaving until the truth comes out." The gravel crunched beneath Nathan's shoes as he stood on the porch of his late aunt's house, the night air thick and still. Sheriff Daniels emerged from his patrol car, the beams of his headlights carving sharp angles through the dark. He was flanked by 2 deputies, their hands resting near their belts, fingers twitching with anticipation. Nathan's jaw tightened, his pulse steady despite the weight of the moment. Daniels paused just a few feet away, his smirk returning as he adjusted his belt. The man moved with the slow confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. Nathan's eyes didn't waver as he met the sheriff's gaze. "Well, look who decided to stay put," Daniels drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "I told you, Cole, you can't just come waltzing into town and dig up trouble like this. You don't belong here." Nathan stepped down from the porch, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the yard. "The only trouble here is you, Daniels, and I'm not going anywhere." Daniels scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "That's so. Because from where I'm standing, you're trespassing, interfering with police investigations, and making my life real difficult." Nathan took a slow breath, his voice steady and sharp. "You're not investigating anything. You're covering up a crime. That house, my house, is the key to something bigger, isn't it? Something you don't want anyone to see." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, but Daniels' expression hardened, his jaw clenching visibly. He stepped closer, his boots grinding into the dirt. "You don't know what you're talking about," Daniels snapped, his tone suddenly venomous. "You city boys think you're smarter than everyone else, don't you? Coming down here, acting like you own the place, telling people like me how to run my town." Nathan's eyes narrowed, unflinching. "It's not your town, Daniels. You just think it is." The sheriff's hand twitched near his holster, but Nathan didn't flinch. The subtle gesture wasn't lost on him, and the deputies shifted nervously behind Daniels. "I know what you're hiding," Nathan continued, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You and your friends have been stealing from families like mine for years, haven't you? Forcing people off their land, burying records, and selling it for a profit. How much are they paying you, Daniels?" "Enough to live with yourself." Daniels' face turned red, the accusation striking deep. He stepped so close that Nathan could smell the faint tang of whiskey on his breath. "You think you're going to waltz into my town, throw around accusations, and walk out of here?" Daniels growled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I built this place, I'm not going to let you ruin it." "You didn't build anything," Nathan said, his tone unyielding. "You just stole what others worked for, and you're going to answer for it." Daniels' eyes flared with something dangerous, and his smirk returned, this time sharper, more vicious. "You think anyone's gonna listen to you? Some big-shot doctor who left town years ago? You're nothing here, Cole. Nothing. You're just another outsider who doesn't know when to leave well enough alone." Nathan tilted his head slightly, his calm a stark contrast to Daniels' escalating fury. "Then why are you so afraid of me?" Daniels froze for just a second, his confidence cracking at the edges. Nathan seized the moment, his voice rising. "Because you know I'm right. You know I'll find the proof that ties you and your friends to everything you've done. You're afraid of the truth, Daniels. That's why you're here with your goons trying to intimidate me." Daniels' face darkened. "You're on thin ice, Cole." "Maybe," Nathan shot back, stepping even closer until they were nose to nose. "But at least I'm standing on the truth." The sheriff's facade finally shattered. Daniels grabbed Nathan by the front of his shirt, shoving him back a step. "I told you to shut your mouth." Nathan didn't resist. He stood tall, his hands at his sides, his voice a razor-sharp edge. "Go ahead, Daniels. Arrest me, assault me, do whatever you want, you'll only prove me right." The deputies hesitated, one of them clearing his throat. "Sheriff, maybe we should—" Daniels spun on them, his voice a whip crack. "Shut up, Travis." The younger deputy flinched, but didn't step back. "We can't rough him up like this, Sheriff. We're already pushing it." Nathan's gaze snapped to the deputy, noting the unease in his voice. "Travis, right?" he said calmly. "You don't have to go along with this. You know it's wrong." "Don't talk to him!" Daniels barked, his face mottled with anger. "You're done, Cole." Nathan turned his attention back to Daniels, unafraid. "You can't silence the truth. You can't stop me." Daniels let out a bitter laugh, his grip still tight on Nathan's shirt. "We'll see about that." The faint sound of gravel shifting behind them caught Nathan's attention. A beam of light suddenly swept across the yard, and the low rumble of a car engine grew louder. Daniels stiffened, his head snapping toward the road, just as a black SUV rolled up and came to a stop. The headlights cut off, and the driver's door opened. Elena Matthews stepped out, holding a folder and her laptop bag. Her voice cut through the darkness like a bell. "Sheriff Daniels, I'd back off if I were you." Daniels' jaw dropped, his grip on Nathan loosening. "What the hell are you doing here?" Elena marched forward with purpose, holding up a handful of documents. "I've got copies of the original land records, unredacted the ones you tried to scrub." She waved the papers deliberately. "And I've already sent the digital versions to my editor. By morning, everyone's going to know exactly what you've been doing." Daniels paled, his bravado faltering for the first time. You can't just make accusations like that." Nathan stepped forward, smoothing his shirt and standing shoulder to shoulder with Elena. "It's not an accusation, it's proof." Daniels glanced back at his deputies, who were now shifting uncomfortably. Travis avoided eye contact, his hand slipping away from his belt. The other deputy, clearly shaken, took a step back. "You're done, Daniels," Elena added firmly. "The council, the developers, the whole scam, it's all going public. There's no covering this up anymore." The sheriff turned on Nathan, his voice a mix of rage and desperation. "You don't understand what you're doing, Cole. You think exposing this is going to change anything. It's bigger than me, bigger than you." Nathan didn't waver. "Maybe, but it ends with you." Daniel stared at him, breathing hard, his face twisting as though he couldn't decide between fight or flight. Finally, he turned and stormed toward his patrol car. "You'll regret this, Cole," he shouted over his shoulder, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and moments later, the car sped down the road, taillights vanishing into the dark. Silence settled over the yard, broken only by the distant sound of crickets. Nathan turned to Elena, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "How did you get here so fast?" Elena smirked, holding up her phone. "I never left. I was parked down the road, waiting to see if Daniels pulled anything. Figured you'd need backup." Nathan chuckled faintly, running a hand over his face. "You always did know how to make an entrance." The two deputies stood awkwardly nearby, avoiding Nathan's gaze. Travis finally stepped forward, his voice low and uncertain. "Dr. Cole, what happens now?" Nathan turned to him, his expression softening. "You start making better choices. This isn't over yet, but you don't have to go down with Daniels. Do the right thing." Travis swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Yeah, okay." Elena glanced at the documents in her hand, her voice filled with determination. "This story's going to hit the morning news cycle. Daniels won't have anywhere to hide." Nathan looked out over the horizon, where the faint glow of dawn was beginning to break. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy on his shoulders, but there was no time for rest. "This is far from over," he murmured. "But we're finally in the fight." Elena nodded, her voice steady. "Let's finish it." The courthouse was packed, the tension suffocating as the trial approached its most crucial moment. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outrage. The story of Nathan Cole's battle against Sheriff Daniels had spread beyond Millbrook, drawing the attention of local and regional media. Reporters lined the aisles, cameras at the ready, waiting for what promised to be an explosive revelation. Nathan sat at the plaintiff's table, his back straight, his suit sharp and tailored. His calm exterior masked the fire burning inside him. Beside him, Elena Matthews scrolled through her notes, her laptop open and flashing key documents they would use as evidence. Across the room, Daniels sat at the defense table, still wearing his sheriff's uniform. His posture was rigid, his expression sour. His lawyer, a wiry man with slicked back hair, whispered furiously in his ear, but Daniels wasn't listening, his narrowed eyes locked on Nathan, brimming with a mixture of hatred and defiance. The judge's gavel echoed like thunder. "Order in the court, plaintiff. You may call your next witness." Nathan stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. "Your Honor, we call Sheriff Grayson Daniels to the stand." A murmur spread through the gallery. Daniels froze for a split second as though considering refusal. Before his lawyer nudged him, he stood stiffly and strode toward the witness box, his boots echoing ominously against the marble floor. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Daniels nodded, raising his hand. "I do." Nathan approached the stand slowly, each step deliberate. The weight of the moment hung between them like a steel chain. Daniels sat, hands folded tightly on his lap, the veins in his neck visible. "Sheriff Daniels," Nathan began, his voice calm and clear. "You've served Millbrook for 20 years. In that time, would you say you've upheld the law fairly and without prejudice?" Daniels sneered faintly, his lips curling. "Of course I'm sworn to protect this community." Nathan tilted his head slightly. "Protect it. Interesting word choice. Sheriff, would you also say you've been diligent in your duties, ensuring property disputes, particularly those involving black families, have been handled with fairness and transparency?" Daniels's jaw tightened. "I don't handle every case personally, my deputies assist." "Ah, but your signature is on every one of these documents, isn't it?" Nathan turned and nodded to Elena. She tapped her laptop, and on the courtroom projector, a series of land transfer records appeared. Gasps rippled through the room. "These records," Nathan continued, "show land deeds transferred under dubious circumstances, mostly from black families in Millbrook, to a company called Pine Hollow Development. A company that, curiously, lists no owner, but has one consistent name in its dealings: Grayson Daniels." Daniels's face flushed red, his lawyer shifting nervously beside him. "Objection!" the lawyer barked. "Irrelevant speculation." The judge raised a brow. "Overruled. Proceed, Dr. Cole." Nathan leaned in slightly, his voice lower but sharper now. "Would you like to explain how a sheriff, sworn to protect his community, also happens to benefit financially from the forced displacement of families in that very community?" Daniel's glare was venomous. "I don't know what you're talking about." Nathan wasn't letting up. "Let's be clear. You've overseen the eviction of dozens of families, Sheriff. Families who suddenly found their homes condemned or their property taxes inflated beyond what they could afford, and every time, those properties ended up in the hands of Pine Hollow Development." Daniels slammed his palm against the witness stand, his voice booming. "This is a witch hunt. People like you come into towns like this and stir up lies to turn everyone against me." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The judge banged her gavel. "Order." Nathan didn't flinch. "People like me. And what kind of people would that be, Sheriff?" Daniels froze, realizing too late he had spoken without thinking. Nathan seized the opening. "No need to answer that," he said calmly. "You've already shown us who you are." Nathan stepped back slightly, his voice now loud enough to reach every corner of the room. "Sheriff Daniels, I'm not the only one you've hurt. Families like mine, my aunt, the woman who raised me, have been forced out of their homes so you could line your pockets. You used your badge, the power of your office, to target those you believed couldn't fight back." "You don't have proof," Daniels shot back, though his voice wavered slightly. "Oh, but I do," Nathan replied smoothly. He turned to Elena, who pulled up an email chain on the projector. "These emails between Daniels and Pine Hollow Development detail the strategy: target specific families, inflate their property taxes, condemn homes under falsified inspections." Daniels's face turned pale. The courtroom gasped again. The sheriff's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is..." "Overruled," the judge said firmly. "Sit down, counselor." Nathan turned back to Daniels, the final nail ready to be driven. "You built your reputation on law and order, but this isn't law. It's theft. You've betrayed the people who trusted you. This is who you really are, Sheriff Daniels. nothing more than a corrupt man using his badge as a shield. The words hung heavy in the air. Daniels gripped the edge of the stand, his face drenched in sweat, his chest heaving. His mask of authority had shattered, leaving only a man exposed for who he was. "I'm done, Your Honor," Nathan said softly, stepping back. The judge nodded. "Sheriff Daniels, you may step down." Daniels rose slowly, his eyes burning into Nathan's, but this time, there was no intimidation left, no threat. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, reporters scribbling furiously as Daniels shuffled back to the defense table, his movements those of a man whose world was crumbling. Nathan returned to his seat beside Elena, exhaling slowly. She turned to him, a small smile breaking through her serious expression. "You did it," she whispered. But Nathan wasn't celebrating yet. He glanced across the room at Daniels, whose lawyer was now furiously gesturing toward him. This wasn't over. The sheriff wasn't a man who would fall quietly, and Nathan knew it. As the judge called for a recess, the gallery erupted with chatter. Nathan stood and turned toward the door, needing a breath of fresh air. Before he could leave, Daniels' voice hissed from behind him. "You think this is over, Cole?" Daniels' face was twisted with hatred, but his eyes flickered with desperation. "You have no idea what you've started." Nathan met his gaze, unafraid. "It's not over, Daniels. It's just beginning." The sheriff's face contorted, and he turned away, collapsing into his seat as reporters swarmed outside the courtroom doors. Nathan stepped into the hallway, the sound of Daniels' voice still echoing in his mind. Elena joined him, holding up her phone. "News outlets already picked up the documents by morning. Everyone's going to know the truth." Nathan nodded, his voice steady, but his gaze distant. "He's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." "Do you think he'll fight back?" Nathan glanced toward the courtroom doors, where Daniels still sat, his lawyer arguing frantically. "I don't think he's done yet," Nathan said quietly. "But neither am I." The days following the courtroom showdown felt like a whirlwind. News of Sheriff Daniels' corruption spread like wildfire. The documents Nathan and Elena had presented were blasted across television networks, news sites, and social media. Millbrook, once an overlooked town, was now at the center of national conversations about systemic injustice, corruption, and abuse of power. Nathan Cole had become the face of that conversation. Local sheriff exposed in land theft scandal. Heart surgeon fights back against small-town corruption. Sheriff Daniels, a fall from power and a town's reckoning. Each headline underscored the same truth. The scales of justice had tipped, and the old guard's grip on Millbrook was loosening. Sheriff Grayson Daniels tried to resist. For days, his attorney appeared on local stations, calling the accusations a smear campaign. Orchestrated by outsiders, Daniels himself held a press conference in front of the sheriff's department, trying to rally his supporters. "I am a man of this town," Daniels declared, his voice shaking as the cameras rolled. "These accusations are lies meant to tear us apart. People like Nathan Cole don't care about Millbrook, they only care about their own agenda." But it was too late. The evidence was undeniable. Documents witnessed testimony. Financial records showing the money Daniels funneled from Pine Hollow development into offshore accounts. It all painted a damning picture of a man who'd used his badge to exploit the very people he had sworn to protect. When the state launched its official investigation, Daniels was stripped of his badge. By the following week, he had been arrested and led out of the sheriff's office in handcuffs. His final walk caught on camera, his face pale and hollow. Nathan watched the footage from his office at the hospital, a mixture of relief and sadness swelling in his chest. Daniels had been a symbol of the system's rot, but he wasn't the system itself. "There's still so much work to do," he muttered under his breath. Elena, who sat across from him, nodded knowingly. "This isn't the end, it's a beginning." Millbrook's reaction was complicated. Daniels' supporters, though now fewer and quieter, clung to his innocence, blaming outsiders for the chaos. Yet a larger portion of the community began to wake up. The revelations of the land theft and systemic prejudice forced people to confront uncomfortable truths. Community meetings grew larger. Voices that had been silenced began to rise. Families shared their stories of unfair taxes, bogus condemnations, and harassment under Daniels' tenure. One by one, neighbors began to connect the dots. This wasn't just a Nathan Cole issue, it was their issue. At the next town hall, Nathan was invited to speak. He hesitated at first, unsure if the community was ready to hear him. But when he stood at the podium, the room fell silent. "Millbrook isn't broken beyond repair," Nathan began, his voice steady. "It's a town with history, strength, and potential, but for too long, that potential has been held back by systems that served a few, instead of all. What happened to my family, to so many families, shouldn't have happened. And it can't happen again." The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was powerful. People rose to their feet, and for the first time in weeks, Nathan felt something he hadn't dared let himself feel. Hope. Late one evening, Nathan returned to the vacant lot where his aunt's house once stood. The air was cool, the stars faintly visible above Millbrook's quiet streets. He walked the property, his footsteps stirring the gravel that had replaced the foundation. It wasn't the first time he'd visited, but this time felt different. For so long, this place had represented loss. It had been a symbol of everything Daniels and his system had stolen. Not just property, but dignity, security, and belonging. But as Nathan looked around now, he saw the future promise. "It's not just about getting it back," he said aloud, as if speaking to his aunt. "It's about building something better." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded document. The deed to the land. After Daniel's exposure, Millbrook's council had invalidated all illegal land transfers, returning properties to their rightful owners. Nathan held the paper tightly, a tear stinging his eye. "We're home again." While Daniels had been the face of the corruption, the aftermath forced the entire town to address its deeper issues. The state-appointed oversight committee began reviewing the sheriff's department, uncovering other deputies complicit in Daniels' schemes. Arrests were made, and resignations followed. For the first time in decades, Millbrook prepared for a new election. Community leaders, young, diverse, and outspoken, stepped forward as candidates, challenging the old guard's control. Activists and lawyers from nearby cities offered their expertise to ensure the election would be fair. At the hospital, Nathan continued his work as a surgeon, but he also embraced a new role: advocate. He was invited to speak at forums, community events, and even universities, sharing his story as a testament to resilience and the importance of standing up for justice. "It's not enough to remove one bad actor," Nathan told a packed auditorium one evening. "We have to rebuild the stage they were standing on." Months later, on a brisk Saturday morning, Millbrook gathered at the town square for the unveiling of a new plaque. It read, "Dedicated to the families who stood against injustice and to those who made Millbrook stronger, a community's resilience begins with its people." Nathan stood near the back of the crowd, quietly observing. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but people still approached him to shake his hand, to thank him. "You gave us the push we needed," one elderly woman said, squeezing his hand. "We're proud of you, son." Nathan smiled, humbled. It was all of us. Nearby, Elena stood with Mitchell, both smiling as they watched the ceremony. Mitchell, still wearing his department uniform, approached Nathan afterward. His demeanor had softened over the months. "Never thought I'd see a day like this in Millbrook," Mitchell admitted, his tone thoughtful. "Change takes time," Nathan replied. "But we've taken the first steps." Mitchell nodded, his gaze steady. "For what it's worth, I'm proud to stand beside you, Dr. Cole." Nathan clapped him on the shoulder. "Hold yourself, and everyone else, accountable. That's how we keep moving forward." As the ceremony ended, Nathan lingered for a moment, watching families, activists, and children play in the square. Millbrook wasn't perfect, there were still wounds to heal, battles to fight, but the shift was undeniable. The town had changed. Nathan's phone buzzed. It was Elena. "You ready for the next one?" Her message read, "Attached was an article about another small town facing corruption." Nathan smiled faintly, pocketing his phone. One step at a time. He glanced at the plaque one more time, his chest swelling with resolve. His aunt's memory, his family's struggles, and the fight he had endured had led to this moment. It wasn't the end of the journey, it was just the beginning of something bigger. Months had passed since the fall of Sheriff Grayson Daniels Millbrook, though still bearing the scars of its long history of corruption and division, was alive with the unmistakable energy of progress. It was subtle at first, the quiet shifts that only someone paying close attention might notice, but Nathan Cole had learned to look for the small victories. The sheriff's department was under new leadership, with a commitment to transparency and fairness. Community forums had become a regular occurrence, where citizens could voice concerns and share ideas without fear of being ignored. Families once pushed to the margins were reclaiming their homes and lives, and the voices that Daniels had tried to silence were now leading the charge for change. For Nathan, life had returned to a semblance of normality. He spent his days back at Millbrook General Hospital, in the operating rooms, where the steady rhythm of heart monitors provided the only sounds he needed. Saving lives was his first calling, and no matter how intense the fight for justice had been, this was where he felt most grounded. But Nathan was not the same man who had driven into Millbrook months earlier. The Nathan who had arrived had been fueled by grief and anger, determined to uncover the truth about his aunt's home and challenge a broken system. The Nathan who now walked through the hospital halls had been changed by the journey, tempered like steel in fire. He carried himself differently, not just with confidence, but with an awareness of the responsibility that came with his voice and position. One afternoon, Nathan stood outside the hospital, sipping a coffee, as the sun sank below the rooftops. Elena joined him, her camera slung casually over her shoulder, a habit she couldn't shake. She smiled at him as she leaned against the railing. "You've changed, you know," she said, her voice light but sincere. Nathan turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "Have I?" "You used to carry everything like a weight," Elena continued, waving a hand for emphasis. "Now it feels like you're carrying it like momentum." Nathan chuckled softly, turning back to the horizon. "Maybe I've learned that there's no such thing as perfect closure," he replied. "There's no going back to the way things were, but there's always a way forward." Elena tilted her head, curious. "And where's forward taking you?" Nathan paused, his expression thoughtful. "I used to think it was enough to just fight back against injustice when it found me. But now I know it's about building something better. Not just for my family, but for every family that's been left behind." She studied him for a moment, admiration softening her features. "Not everyone would have had the strength to do what you did, Nathan. A lot of people would have walked away." Nathan smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Walking away would have been easier. But my aunt didn't raise me to take the easy road, and people like Sheriff Daniels, they count on us walking away. They count on the silence." He turned to face Elena, his voice calm but firm. "I won't be silent anymore." The story of Millbrook and Sheriff Daniels had grown far beyond the borders of the small-town media outlets had picked up on the scandal, using it to fuel a larger discussion about corruption, systemic racism, and abuse of power in communities across the country. Talk shows and op-eds debated the importance of accountability and the bravery it took to challenge entrenched systems. Nathan had been invited to share his story at conferences and town halls. He spoke not as a politician or an activist, but as a man who had been tested by fire and come through with his purpose sharpened. At one event, a student approached him after his speech, her eyes wide with admiration. "How did you keep going?" she asked. "When everything felt so stacked against you?" Nathan crouched slightly so he could meet her gaze. "I remembered what I was fighting for," he replied. "My family, my community, and the truth. When you know what you're fighting for, it becomes harder to give up." She nodded, absorbing his words, and Nathan added, "And you don't have to fight alone. Find people who believe in the same things, who will stand beside you. Change isn't something one person can do, it's what we do together." Nathan's words rang true for Millbrook. The changes didn't come overnight, and not everything was fixed. Some people still resisted, clinging to old ways and old beliefs. There were still whispers of doubt, and the wounds Daniels had inflicted would take years to fully heal. But something had shifted. Conversations that once felt impossible were now being had. Neighbors who had lived in silence were speaking up. A sense of ownership had returned to the community. This was their town, and they would decide what its future looked like. And Nathan Cole was ready to help guide that future. One crisp morning, Nathan returned to the lot where his aunt's house had once stood. The land was quiet, but there was no emptiness in it anymore. Plans for a community garden had already begun, led by local volunteers and students who wanted to turn the space into something meaningful. Nathan crouched down, digging his fingers into the soil and letting it sift through his hands. He could almost hear his aunt's voice, her laughter, the way she used to call him Natey when he was small. "We're still here," he whispered softly to the wind, "and we're not going anywhere." As he stood, he saw a young boy watching him curiously from the edge of the lot. Nathan smiled and beckoned him closer. "You live around here?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Yeah, just over there." He pointed to a house nearby. "They said this is gonna be a garden." "That's right," Nathan said. "A place for the community, for all of us." The boy looked up at him, squinting in the sunlight. "Did you do this?" Nathan shook his head, his smile growing. "No. We did this." Nathan Cole's story was one of struggle and loss, but it was also one of hope. He hadn't set out to be a hero or a symbol. He had set out to stand up for what was right. His fight against Daniels was more than personal. It became a reckoning for a town that had looked the other way for too long. In the end, the message was clear. Injustice only thrives when people are silent, and change is possible when good people refuse to look away. Millbrook's story was far from over, but it was on the right path, and Nathan's legacy was etched into its foundation. A reminder that resilience, courage, and community could build something stronger than fear. As the seasons turned and the community garden began to bloom, people would look at that space and remember what it stood for: justice, hope, and the power of standing together.